13-year-old Tamika Harper was the kind of girl who stood out, not because she tried to, but because of her undeniable presence. Confident, intelligent, and unafraid to voice her opinions, she was a natural leader among her peers. Her signature was her natural hair, styled in creative and bold ways that reflected her personality. Every curl, braid, and twist told a story of resilience and self-love, a legacy passed down from her mother, Amelia Harper, a fiercely determined civil rights lawyer. Tamika's school life, however, was far from smooth. Being one of the few black students in her suburban middle school meant constantly navigating microaggressions from both classmates and adults who should have known better. But Tamika had learned to handle herself with grace, often turning others' discomfort into teaching moments. What she couldn't prepare for, though, was the quiet hostility of her art teacher, Ms. Deborah Sanders. Ms. Sanders was the epitome of strict authority. In her late 40s, she had built a reputation as a no-nonsense teacher who demanded perfection from her students. On the surface, she was the picture of professionalism, polished, articulate, and well-respected by her colleagues. But beneath the veneer was a woman whose biases shaped the way she treated certain students. Tamika, with her vibrant personality and refusal to shrink herself to fit into Ms. Sanders' rigid mold, became a target. It started subtly. A comment about her hair being distracting during a presentation, a suggestion that her use of bold colors in a painting was too much and lacked refinement. Ms. Sanders framed her critiques as constructive, but Tamika could feel the undercurrent of something more insidious, a quiet attempt to diminish her spirit. One chilly autumn morning, the tension came to a head. The class was in the middle of a unit on sculpture, and students were tasked with creating three-dimensional self-portraits. Tamika had approached the assignment with her usual creativity, envisioning a sculpture that incorporated elements of her cultural heritage. She brought beads and cowrie shells from home, planning to weave them into the piece as a tribute to her ancestors. As the students gathered their materials, Ms. Sanders began her usual rounds, inspecting everyone's work. When she reached Tamika's table, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Tamika," she said, her voice cold and measured, "what exactly are you doing with those beads?" "They're part of my design," Tamika replied, meeting her teacher's gaze without hesitation. "I want to incorporate them into the hair of the sculpture. It represents my heritage." Ms. Sanders raised an eyebrow, her disapproval evident. "This assignment is about sculpting, not accessorizing. You need to focus on the clay work itself. The beads are unnecessary and will only detract from the piece." Tamika felt her chest tighten. "But isn't art about expression? I thought we were supposed to make this personal." Ms. Sanders' eyes narrowed. "Personal doesn't mean overdone. Follow the instructions, Tamika. Simplicity is key." The exchange left a bitter taste in Tamika's mouth, but she wasn't one to back down. She continued working on her sculpture, beads and all, determined to stay true to her vision. Around her, classmates exchanged uneasy glances, aware of the tension but unsure how to react. Some admired Tamika's courage, others simply hoped to avoid Ms. Sanders' ire themselves. As the lesson progressed, Ms. Sanders hovered near Tamika's table, her disapproval palpable. Then came the moment that would change everything. The students were using glue guns to attach small details to their sculptures, and Ms. Sanders was responsible for distributing the materials. When she approached Tamika, she handed her a bottle of glue that looked different from the others, its label faded, the contents slightly thicker. Tamika didn't think much of it at first. She was focused on her work, carefully attaching the beads to her sculpture. But as she pressed a bead into place, a glob of glue dripped onto her hand. It burned. She yelped in pain, dropping the sculpture onto the table. "What's wrong now?" Tamika Miss Sanders asked, her tone laced with impatience. "The glue, it's burning my hand," Tamika said, her voice trembling as she tried to wipe it off. But the substance only spread, sticking to her fingers and hardening quickly. In her panic, she brushed her hand against her hair, transferring the glue to her curls. The room fell silent as Tamika froze, realizing what had just happened. Her hair, her crown, was being ruined before her eyes. Ms. Sanders crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You should be more careful. This is why I emphasize following directions. Now look at the mess you've made." Tamika stared at her teacher, disbelief and fury swirling within her. "You gave me this glue," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not the same as everyone else's. Why would you?" Ms. Sanders cut her off. "Don't blame me for your mistakes. If you spent less time arguing and more time paying attention, this wouldn't have happened." Tears welled up in Tamika's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stormed out of the classroom, her classmates parting to let her pass. In the hallway, she ran to the bathroom, desperate to save what she could of her hair. The glue had already hardened, turning her once soft curls into brittle clumps. She scrubbed at it with soap and water, but it was no use. Her scalp burned from the effort, and the tears she had held back now flowed freely. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, Ms. Sanders continued the lesson, as if nothing had happened. Some students whispered among themselves, horrified by what they had witnessed. Others sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to process the situation. One thing was clear: this was no accident. Ms. Sanders had deliberately targeted Tamika, using the assignment as an excuse to humiliate her. By the time Tamika returned to class, her hair wrapped in a makeshift scarf, the school day was almost over. She avoided eye contact with everyone, focusing on packing her things. As the bell rang, Ms. Sanders called out, "I hope this has been a learning experience for you, Tamika. Maybe now you'll understand the importance of discipline." Tamika didn't respond. She walked out of the room, her head held high despite the ache in her chest. She didn't know how, but she would make sure Ms. Sanders faced the consequences of her actions. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. When Tamika got home that evening, the weight of the day seemed to crash down on her all at once. She had managed to hold her composure as she left the classroom and even during the bus ride home, but now, in the safety of her own house, the dam broke. Tears streamed down her face as she locked herself in the bathroom, staring at the reflection of her damaged hair. The glue had hardened completely, turning her once soft curls into stiff, brittle strands that snapped at the lightest touch. Her scalp ached from the abrasive attempts to remove it earlier, and no amount of washing seemed to help. Her mind raced with questions and anger. Why had Ms. Sanders given her that glue? Why had she acted like it was Tamika's fault? Most of all, why did no one in the classroom stand up for her? Her mother, Amelia Harper, was in the kitchen when she heard Tamika's muffled sobs. As a seasoned civil rights attorney, Amelia had fought countless battles for others, standing up against injustice wherever she found it. But nothing prepared her for the sharp pang of worry that pierced her heart when she realized her daughter was crying. She knocked gently on the bathroom door. "Tamika, sweetheart, it's me. Are you okay?" Tamika hesitated before unlocking the door. Amelia stepped inside and immediately froze when she saw the state of her daughter's hair. The glue had clumped and matted the strands together, creating patches of damage that were impossible to ignore. Tamika's eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her hands trembled as she tried to explain what had happened. "Ms. Sanders. She gave me a bottle of glue," Tamika began, her voice shaking. "It wasn't like the others. It was thicker, and it started burning my hand when it touched me. I didn't know what to do, and it got in my hair." Amelia's expression hardened, but she kept her voice calm. "She gave you a different bottle of glue? On purpose?" Tamika nodded, struggling to hold back another wave of tears. "And then she blamed me for it. She said it was my fault for not being careful." Amelia crouched down to Tamika's level, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me, Tamika. This is not your fault. What she did, whatever her reasons, was wrong, and we're not going to let her get away with it." For the rest of the evening, Amelia worked on soothing Tamika's scalp and carefully removing what she could of the glue. It was a painstaking process, and even after hours of effort, much of the damage remained. Tamika's hair, once a source of pride and joy, now felt like a reminder of the humiliation she had endured. Amelia could see how deeply this had affected her daughter, and it ignited a fire within her. This wasn't just about hair, it was about the deliberate attempt to strip Tamika of her dignity. The next morning, Amelia decided to take immediate action. She called the school to request a meeting with the principal, Mrs. Caldwell, and Ms. Sanders. The receptionist, sounding slightly nervous, assured her that a meeting could be arranged that afternoon. Amelia sensed that the school was already aware of the incident, though they were likely hoping to downplay it. She warned Tamika that she would be accompanying her to school, and while Tamika felt a mix of relief and embarrassment, she trusted her mother's determination. When they arrived at the school, the atmosphere was tense. Students whispered among themselves as they passed Tamika in the hallways, some offering her pitying looks, others avoiding her altogether. News of the incident had spread quickly, though the details were muddled. By the time they reached the principal's office, Amelia was more than ready to confront whoever had allowed this to happen. Mrs. Caldwell greeted them with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Harper, Tamika, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Amelia didn't bother returning the pleasantry. She sat down, her posture straight and her expression firm. "Let's get straight to the point, Mrs. Caldwell. My daughter was deliberately given an unsafe material to work with during her art class yesterday, which resulted in serious damage to her hair and skin. I want to know what you plan to do about it." Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat, glancing at the paperwork on her desk. "I understand your concerns, and I've spoken briefly with Ms. Sanders about the incident. She assured me it was an unfortunate accident." "An accident?" Amelia interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Are you telling me that Ms. Sanders accidentally gave my daughter a different glue from everyone else? That she accidentally blamed Tamika for what happened afterward? Because from where I'm standing, this looks deliberate." The principal's expression faltered. Before she could respond, the door opened, and Ms. Sanders walked in, carrying a stack of folders. She greeted Mrs. Caldwell with a curt nod before turning her attention to Amelia and Tamika. Her demeanor was calm, almost smug, as if she had already convinced herself of her own innocence. "Mrs. Harper, Ms. Sanders began, her tone clipped. "I'm sorry to hear about Tamika's experience, but I assure you, there was no malicious intent. The glue she used was simply a leftover supply from a previous project. I had no idea it would cause such an issue." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "Leftover supply? So you admit you gave her something different from the rest of the class?" Ms. Sanders hesitated, realizing her mistake. "Well, yes, but it wasn't intentional. I was simply using what was available." Amelia leaned forward, her voice sharp. "And what about blaming my daughter for what happened, telling her it was her fault for not being careful? Do you consider that appropriate behavior from a teacher?" Ms. Sanders flushed slightly but held her ground. "Tamika has a tendency to." overreact. I was trying to teach her a lesson about responsibility. Tamika, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched into fists. You weren't teaching me a lesson. You were trying to humiliate me. The room fell silent for a moment. Ms. Sanders opened her mouth to respond, but Amelia cut her off. This is unacceptable. Ms. Sanders, whether you intended to or not, you caused my daughter physical harm and emotional distress. You also failed to provide her with a safe learning environment, which is your responsibility as an educator. I expect an apology, not excuses. Mrs. Caldwell interjected, trying to regain control of the conversation. Mrs. Harper, I understand your frustration, and I assure you we take this matter seriously. We will investigate further to determine what actions need to be taken. Amelia wasn't satisfied. An investigation isn't enough. I want to see documentation of the materials Ms. Sanders is using in her classroom. I want to know why unsafe supplies were even accessible to students. And I want a clear plan for how you're going to ensure this doesn't happen again. Mrs. Caldwell nodded stiffly. Of course. I'll have my staff compile the necessary information. As the meeting ended, Amelia left the office feeling a mix of anger and resolve. She knew the school would try to sweep this under the rug if given the chance, but she wasn't about to let that happen. Tamika deserved justice, and Amelia would make sure she got it even if it meant taking matters into her own hands. This was only the beginning. The morning following the tense meeting with the school principal and Ms. Sanders, Amelia Harper felt a renewed sense of determination. She had seen firsthand how institutions like this one often sought to minimize or obscure wrongdoing, prioritizing their reputation over the well-being of students. But Amelia wasn't the kind of person to let things slide, especially not when it came to her daughter. Tamika had woken up that day quieter than usual, her confidence clearly shaken by the events of the previous day. Her normally spirited energy was dulled, and it only solidified Amelia's resolve to take action. As they walked into the school together, the atmosphere in the halls was thick with whispers. Tamika tried to keep her head high, but Amelia could see the tension in her shoulders. Students darted glances in their direction, some wide-eyed, others muttering to each other under their breath. Amelia recognized the look of young gossipers, the sort who reveled in spreading rumors, but rarely understood the weight of what they were talking about. It was infuriating, but she ignored it, focusing instead on her plan for the day. Amelia had decided to sit in on Tamika's art class. The school, likely under pressure from her persistent demands, had reluctantly allowed it, citing her right as a parent to observe the educational environment. As they entered the classroom, Ms. Sanders' reaction was immediate and telling. The teacher's face froze for a moment before quickly contorting into a tight, professional smile that barely hid her irritation. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper, Ms." Sanders said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "To what do we owe the pleasure of your company today?" Amelia returned the smile with one of her own, equally sharp. "I'm here to observe. I want to ensure my daughter is being treated fairly and safely after yesterday's incident." Ms. Sanders' lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded curtly and turned her attention to the rest of the class. Tamika took her seat at the back of the room, and Amelia positioned herself in a chair near the side, where she could see everything without being in the way. She kept her notepad and pen in hand, prepared to document anything suspicious. The lesson began with Ms. Sanders handing out materials for a new project. Amelia watched closely as the teacher distributed the supplies, noting the subtle differences in her tone and demeanor when interacting with certain students. To the quieter, more reserved kids, Ms. Sanders offered gentle encouragement. To others, particularly Tamika and a handful of other students of color, her tone was clipped and her instructions harsher. When Ms. Sanders approached Tamika's table, Amelia could feel her muscles tense. The teacher placed a small block of clay on the desk in front of Tamika and said, "This should be enough for you. Let's see if you can stick to the instructions this time." Tamika didn't respond, keeping her focus on the clay, but Amelia could see her jaw tighten. The comment wasn't overtly hostile, but it was needling an unnecessary jab designed to undermine Tamika's confidence. Amelia made a note of it, her pen moving quickly across the paper. As the class continued, Ms. Sanders began walking around the room, inspecting students' progress. When she reached Tamika again, she leaned over the desk, her voice low but still loud enough for Amelia to hear. "Why are you working so slowly, Ms.?" Sanders asked. "You're falling behind. If you keep this up, you'll never finish on time." Tamika clenched her hands into fists, the frustration evident on her face. "I'm just making sure it's done right," she replied evenly, though her voice shook slightly. Ms. Sanders let out a dismissive sigh. "Done right doesn't mean taking forever. You need to learn how to balance quality with speed." Amelia couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up from her chair, her voice calm but firm. "Ms. Sanders, if you're concerned about my daughter's progress, perhaps offering constructive guidance instead of criticism would be more effective." The entire room went silent. Students froze mid-motion, their eyes darting between Amelia and Ms. Sanders. The teacher straightened, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "I appreciate your input, Mrs. Harper," Ms. Sanders said through gritted teeth, "but I believe I know how to manage my classroom." Amelia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sure you do. But managing a classroom also means fostering an environment where students feel supported, not singled out or belittled. Don't you agree?" Ms. Sanders opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, one of the other students raised their hand hesitantly. Ms. Sanders? "I think Tamika's project looks really good so far," the student said, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. Ms. Sanders shot the student a sharp look but forced a tight smile. "Thank you for your observation. Now, let's all focus on our work." The rest of the class passed without further incident, but Amelia could feel the hostility radiating from Ms. Sanders. She stayed until the lesson ended, watching as Tamika quietly packed up her things. As they left the room, Amelia placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You're doing great," she whispered. "Don't let her get to you." After leaving the classroom, Amelia headed straight to the administrative office. She requested a meeting with the principal again, but this time she also demanded access to the school's supply records. "I want to know exactly what materials are being used in Ms. Sanders' classroom," she said firmly. "If yesterday's incident was truly an accident, then there should be no issue providing that information." The office staff looked uneasy but promised to pass along the request. Amelia wasn't convinced they would follow through, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. She began reaching out to other parents, particularly those whose children had mentioned issues with Ms. Sanders in the past. Over the next few days, she gathered testimonies from several families who described similar patterns of behavior, unnecessary harshness, favoritism, and a clear bias against certain students. One particularly damning account came from a parent whose child had been reduced to tears during an art critique. According to the parent, Ms. Sanders had torn apart the student's project, calling it sloppy and uninspired in front of the entire class. The child, who was only 10 years old at the time, had since developed a fear of participating in creative assignments. Amelia listened to these stories with a growing sense of anger, her determination only deepening. While gathering these accounts, Amelia also managed to obtain a copy of the school's supply orders through a contact she had in the district. What she found was alarming. The industrial-grade glue that had damaged Tamika's hair wasn't listed among the approved materials for classroom use. In fact, it wasn't supposed to be in the school at all. This discovery was the final piece of evidence Amelia needed to prove that Ms. Sanders had acted recklessly, if not maliciously. Armed with this information, Amelia requested another meeting with Mrs. Caldwell, this time insisting that Ms. Sanders also be present. When the day of the meeting arrived, Amelia walked into the principal's office with an air of quiet confidence. She placed the supply records on the desk in front of Mrs. Caldwell and said, "This glue was not approved for use in classrooms. Why was it in Ms. Sanders' possession?" Mrs. Caldwell paled slightly as she scanned the documents. Ms. Sanders, seated across the table, looked visibly uncomfortable but tried to maintain her composure. I must have picked it up by mistake," she stammered. "I didn't realize it wasn't part of the standard supplies." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "A mistake that resulted in my daughter being physically harmed. And what about the other students you've humiliated and mistreated? Were those also mistakes?" Ms. Sanders flushed, her hands clenching in her lap. "I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Harper, but I have always acted in the best interest of my students." Amelia leaned forward, her voice steady but sharp. "Your best interest has caused real harm. It's time for accountability." The tension in the room was palpable as Mrs. Caldwell struggled to find the right words. "Mrs. Harper," she began carefully, "I understand your concerns, and I assure you we will take appropriate action to address this situation." "I hope so," Amelia replied, standing up. "Because if you don't, I will." As she left the office, Amelia felt a sense of vindication, but she knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle, one that she was more than prepared to win. Amelia Harper's fight was far from over, and the events that followed only made it clear how deeply the school was entrenched in protecting its own. After the heated meeting with the principal and Ms. Sanders, Amelia expected some form of immediate action, perhaps even an announcement acknowledging what had happened. But instead, the school's response was silence, and infuriating, calculated silence that spoke louder than any official statement ever could. It was a strategy Amelia recognized all too well from her years as a civil rights attorney: delay, deflect, and deny until the storm blew over. But this storm wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the meeting, Tamika reluctantly returned to school. Amelia had considered keeping her daughter home for a few days, but Tamika insisted that staying away would only make her seem weak. "I don't want her to think she's won," she said with quiet determination. Amelia felt a swell of pride but also an ache of sadness. No child should have to prove their strength in the face of this kind of adversity. When they arrived at school, Tamika noticed that some of her classmates had started treating her differently. A few approached her with awkward apologies or whispered words of support, but most avoided her altogether, as though simply being associated with her might bring trouble. The isolation was palpable, and it weighed on Tamika, even if she tried not to show it. Amelia saw the change in her daughter's demeanor and felt her resolve harden further. This wasn't just about one teacher anymore, it was about the system that allowed someone like Ms. Sanders to thrive unchecked. Amelia spent the next several days gathering more evidence and building her case. She dug deeper into the school's records, obtaining a detailed list of materials ordered for all classrooms over the past year. What she found confirmed her suspicions: the industrial glue that had damaged Tamika's hair wasn't just an oversight or a misplaced item. It had been ordered specifically by Ms. Sanders, despite clear guidelines prohibiting the use of hazardous materials in classrooms without proper authorization. Amelia also discovered that this wasn't the first time Ms. Sanders had circumvented school policy. There were records of unauthorized purchases dating back several years, though no one had ever bothered to question them. In the meantime, Amelia reached out to more parents, many of whom had stories eerily similar to Tamika's. One mother recounted how her son had been ridiculed in front of the entire class for not understanding the assignment even though Ms. Sanders had failed to provide clear instructions. Another parent described how their daughter, a talented young artist, had stopped participating in art class altogether after being repeatedly told that her work was too abstract and lacked discipline. These stories painted a clear picture of a teacher who used her position not to nurture creativity, but to exert control and punish those who didn't fit her narrow expectations. Despite the mounting evidence, the school remained frustratingly passive. Mrs. Caldwell, the principal, had sent a vague email to parents acknowledging concerns raised by a recent classroom incident, but failed to provide any specifics or outline any steps the school was taking to address the issue. Amelia knew this was a deliberate move to placate parents without admitting fault, and it only fueled her determination to escalate the matter. One afternoon, as Amelia was reviewing her notes at the kitchen table, she received an unexpected call from one of Tamika's classmates, a girl named Lily. Her voice was quiet and hesitant as she explained why she was reaching out. "I saw what happened that day in class," Lily said. "With the glue. I think Ms. Sanders did it on purpose." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "What makes you say that?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Lily hesitated before continuing. "Before class started, I saw her switch the glue bottles. She had a different one in her hand, and she put it on Tamika's table when no one was looking. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after everything that happened, I think she meant to use it to mess with Tamika." Amelia thanked Lily for her bravery and asked if she would be willing to share what she had seen in a formal statement. Lily agreed, though her nervousness was clear. "I just don't want her to get away with it," she said quietly before hanging up. Amelia sat back in her chair, a mixture of anger and vindication coursing through her. This was the proof she needed: concrete evidence that Ms. Sanders' actions had been deliberate. The following day, Amelia returned to the school armed with everything she had gathered: the supply records, the testimonies from parents, and Lily's statement. She demanded an emergency meeting with the school board, bypassing Mrs. Caldwell entirely. The board, clearly unprepared for such a direct confrontation, reluctantly agreed to meet later that week. In the meantime, Amelia decided to pay another visit to Ms. Sanders' classroom, this time unannounced. When Amelia entered the room, she found Ms. Sanders alone, preparing for the next lesson. The teacher looked up, startled, but quickly recovered her composure. "Mrs. Harper," she said coolly, "what can I do for you?" "I think you know why I'm here," Amelia replied, her voice steady but laced with steel. "I've spoken to one of Tamika's classmates. She saw you switch the glue bottles before class. Care to explain?" Ms. Sanders' face went pale, but she quickly masked it with indignation. "That's a ridiculous accusation," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I would never do something like that." Amelia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "The evidence says otherwise, and if you think you can lie your way out of this, you're sorely mistaken. I've already scheduled a meeting with the school board, and I intend to make sure they see exactly who you are." For the first time, Ms. Sanders seemed genuinely rattled. She opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by the sound of the classroom door opening. Mrs. Caldwell walked in, her expression carefully neutral. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Amelia and Ms. Sanders. I was just informing MS. Sanders that I've uncovered new evidence regarding her actions, Amelia said. I assume you'll be joining us at the school board meeting. Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Of course, she said finally. We'll resolve this matter appropriately. As Amelia left the classroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that both the principal and MS. Sanders were scrambling to cover their tracks. But it didn't matter. The truth was on her side, and she wasn't going to let them intimidate her into backing down. The day of the school board meeting arrived, and Amelia walked into the room with Tamika by her side. The room was packed with parents, teachers, and a handful of students, all eager to see how the situation would unfold. The board members sat at a long table at the front, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Amelia began her presentation by laying out the facts, the unauthorized glue, the testimonies from parents and students, and the evidence of a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond Tamika's case. She spoke with conviction, her voice steady and clear, as she detailed how MS. Sanders had used her position to bully and humiliate students under the guise of discipline. When it was MS. Sanders turned to speak, her defense was weak and riddled with contradictions. She tried to paint herself as a dedicated teacher who had simply been misunderstood, but the weight of the evidence against her was impossible to ignore. By the time Amelia played a recording of Lily's testimony, the room was silent except for the sound of MS. Sanders shifting uncomfortably in her seat. In the end, the board had no choice but to act. They announced that MS. Sanders would be placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and they committed to reviewing the school's policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As Amelia and Tamika left the meeting, they were met with quiet applause from some of the parents and students in attendance. For the first time in weeks, Tamika smiled, a small but genuine smile that told Amelia they were on the right path. The school board's decision to place MS. Sanders on administrative leave had stirred up the hornet's nest, but for Amelia Harper, it was only the beginning. While the move was a public acknowledgement of the issue, she knew it was also a tactic to buy time and mitigate further fallout. It was clear the school wanted to project the image of taking action without delving too deeply into the systemic failures that allowed someone like MS. Sanders to operate unchecked. Amelia wasn't going to let them off the hook so easily, not when Tamika was still suffering the consequences of their negligence. In the days that followed the meeting, the tension at the school escalated. News of MS. Sanders' suspension spread quickly among parents and students, creating a divide within the community. Some parents supported Amelia's efforts, grateful that someone was finally standing up to address the teacher's behavior. Others, however, defended MS. Sanders, claiming she was being unfairly targeted for simply being strict. The latter group's complaints were often thinly veiled with biases of their own, accusing Amelia of blowing things out of proportion and stirring trouble. The whispers and passive-aggressive comments were expected, but they only fueled Amelia's determination. She had faced worse in courtrooms and public forums. She wasn't about to back down from a school board or a handful of disgruntled parents. For Tamika, the fallout was more immediate and personal. Some of her classmates, emboldened by their parents' opinions, began to treat her with open hostility. Where there had once been whispers, now there were snide remarks and intentional exclusion. In art class, where a substitute teacher had taken over, Tamika found herself seated alone at the back of the room. When she tried to participate, her comments were often met with derision from certain students who had taken it upon themselves to act as MS. Sanders' defenders. One day, as Tamika worked quietly on a new project, she overheard a group of girls mocking her. "She probably made up the whole glue thing," one of them said with a sneer. Anything to get attention. Yeah, another chimed in. Her mum's just looking for a reason to sue someone. That's what lawyers do, right? Tamika clenched her fists, the words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She had thought the hardest part was over when Ms. Sanders was suspended, but now it felt like the battle had only shifted. It wasn't just her teacher she was fighting anymore, it was the entire culture of the school. When Tamika told her mother about the incident later that evening, Amelia's reaction was immediate and fierce. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said, pacing the living room like a general preparing for war. It's a classic tactic. When the system is exposed, it shifts the blame onto the victim to distract from its own failures. But we're not going to let them get away with it. Amelia decided to take the fight to the next level. She contacted a trusted forensic expert she had worked with in previous cases, someone who specialized in analyzing materials and chemical substances. She sent samples of the glue that had been used on Tamika's hair, along with documentation showing that it wasn't approved for classroom use. The expert's findings were damning. Not only was the glue hazardous, but its chemical composition was entirely inappropriate for any environment involving children. The report included a detailed breakdown of the risks associated with prolonged exposure, including potential skin burns and respiratory irritation. Armed with this new evidence, Amelia scheduled another meeting with the school board. This time, however, she also invited representatives from the local press and a lawyer specializing in education law. If the school wanted to play games, she was prepared to match them move for move. The meeting was tense from the moment Amelia walked into the room. The board members sat stiffly at the long table, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and unease. Mrs. Caldwell, the principal, was conspicuously absent, though Amelia suspected this was a calculated move to avoid further scrutiny. The board president, a man in his 60s with a perpetually furrowed brow, cleared his throat as Amelia took her seat. "Mrs. Harper," he began, his tone carefully measured, "we appreciate your commitment to addressing this matter, but we believe the steps we've taken so far are sufficient. Ms. Sanders is on leave, and we are conducting a thorough investigation." Amelia didn't flinch. "Your investigation is inadequate," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've suspended a teacher without addressing the broader issue of how someone like her was allowed to behave this way for years. And now, instead of taking responsibility, this school is fostering an environment where my daughter is being ostracized and harassed." The board president's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Amelia placed the forensic report on the table and slid it toward him. "This is a chemical analysis of the glue Ms. Sanders used in her classroom. It's toxic, and it should never have been in the hands of students. I want to know why your safety protocols failed to prevent this." The room fell silent as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger woman who had seemed sympathetic during the previous meeting, finally spoke up. This is serious," she said, her voice hesitant. "If this glue was unauthorized, then we need to re-evaluate our oversight processes." "Re-evaluate," Amelia repeated, her tone cutting. "You need to overhaul them. And you need to start by holding the people responsible accountable. That includes Ms. Sanders and anyone who enabled her." The board president shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mrs. Harper, we understand your concerns, but—" But what Amelia interrupted, leaning forward. "Are you going to tell me that this is all a misunderstanding? That my daughter's suffering is just an unfortunate coincidence? Because I'm not leaving this room until I get answers." At that moment, one of the journalists Amelia had invited raised their hand. "If I may," the journalist said, "are there plans to notify parents about the potential safety risks posed by unauthorized materials in classrooms? And if not, why?" The board members froze, clearly unprepared for the question. Amelia hid a small smile. She had anticipated this exact reaction and had strategically ensured the press would be present to hold them accountable. The board president stammered out a vague response about ongoing evaluations and internal reviews, but it was clear the pressure was mounting. As the meeting continued, it became evident that the school's leadership was scrambling to contain the situation. They promised to implement stricter safety protocols and conduct a comprehensive audit of all classroom materials, but Amelia wasn't satisfied with empty promises. She pushed for concrete timelines and demanded regular updates on their progress. By the time the meeting ended, the board members looked thoroughly rattled, and Amelia knew she had struck a nerve. In the days that followed, Amelia's persistence began to yield results. The school announced a new set of guidelines for classroom safety, including mandatory training for teachers on the proper use of materials. They also initiated a formal review of Ms. Sanders' past conduct, though Amelia suspected this was more about appeasing public scrutiny than genuine accountability. Still, it was a step in the right direction. For Tamika, the changes were bittersweet. While she felt a sense of vindication knowing her mother's efforts were making a difference, the emotional toll of the ordeal lingered. She still faced hostility from some classmates, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But she found strength in her mother's unwavering support and in the knowledge that her story was helping to create a safer environment for other students. One afternoon, as Tamika and Amelia sat together in the living room, Tamika turned to her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked. "The school, I mean." Amelia smiled gently. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But every step we take gets us closer. And sometimes the fight itself is just as important as the outcome." Tamika nodded, her eyes bright with determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every student who had ever been silenced or mistreated. And with her mother by her side, she knew she had the strength to keep going. The culmination of Amelia Harper's fight against the school system began to take shape with an unmistakable tension in the air. The school board's attempts at appeasement had proven insufficient. The changes they announced, mandatory training for teachers, audits of classroom materials, and reviews of safety protocols, were steps in the right direction, but they were reactive measures, not proactive accountability. To Amelia, this was clear evidence that the system was more invested in damage control than in meaningful reform. The deeper issue, the systemic bias that allowed someone like Ms. Sanders to operate unchecked for so long, remained unaddressed. And for that, Amelia knew she would need to push harder, even if it meant taking the fight beyond the school walls. The board's investigation into Ms. Sanders' actions appeared to stall. Weeks passed with no updates, no consequences, and no clarity about the teacher's future. In the meantime, Ms. Sanders, though officially on administrative leave, had begun rallying support from certain parents and teachers. Whispers of her victimization circulated in the community, with some claiming she was being unfairly targeted for enforcing discipline and holding students to high standards. Ms. Sanders even made subtle statements to her supporters about being silenced for doing her job. It was a calculated move, one Amelia recognized as a tactic to shift the narrative and paint herself as the real victim. The final straw came when Amelia learned that Ms. Sanders had filed an appeal to return to her teaching position, claiming the suspension was unjustified. The idea that this woman could walk back into a classroom, unscathed and unrepentant, after what she had done to Tamika and countless other students, was unthinkable. Amelia's frustration boiled over. It was time to act decisively. And she called a town meeting, using her connections and her reputation as a civil rights attorney to ensure maximum turnout. The school board, reluctant but unable to ignore the mounting public pressure, agreed to participate. The auditorium was packed on the night of the meeting, the energy in the room electric with anticipation. Parents, teachers, students, and community members filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. On one side of the room, Amelia sat with Tamika, surrounded by supporters who had come to stand with them. On the other side, a smaller but vocal group of MS. Sanders defenders huddled together, their expressions defiant. The board members took their seats at the front of the auditorium, looking visibly uncomfortable under the weight of so many watchful eyes. At the center of the table sat the board president, flanked by Mrs. Caldwell and several other officials. The tension was palpable as the meeting began, with the board president making a few brief remarks about the importance of transparency and accountability. But as soon as he opened the floor to public comments, Amelia stood, her presence commanding the room's attention. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and clear. "We're here tonight because of a failure not just of one teacher, but of an entire system that allowed her behavior to go unchecked for years. My daughter, Tamika, is not the first student to suffer under MS. Sanders' care, and unless we confront the truth, she won't be the last." Amelia's words hung in the air, heavy with truth. She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "I've spent weeks gathering evidence, listening to parents and students, and piecing together a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond a single incident. MS. Sanders used her position as a teacher to bully and demean students who didn't conform to her narrow expectations, students who, more often than not, looked like my daughter." A murmur rippled through the audience, some nodding in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Amelia continued, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about Tamika. It's about every student who has ever been silenced, every parent who has ever been dismissed, and every community that has ever been told to accept the unacceptable. And tonight, we demand accountability." She placed a stack of documents on the table in front of the board members. "Here is a forensic analysis of the glue MS. Sanders gave my daughter a material that was unauthorized and dangerous. Here are testimonies from parents and students describing years of mistreatment. And here is proof that MS. Sanders knowingly violated school policies time and time again, with no consequences. What more do you need to act?" The board president shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the papers but not picking them up. Amelia pressed on. "And let me be clear, accountability isn't just about removing one bad teacher. It's about examining the culture that allowed her to thrive. It's about making systemic changes to ensure this never happens again." At that moment, one of MS. Sanders' supporters stood up, a middle-aged man with an air of self-importance. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. MS. Sanders is a dedicated teacher who was just doing her job. Not every student can handle discipline, and frankly, not every parent can handle the truth about their child. Amelia turned to face him, her expression unflinching. "Discipline doesn't mean humiliation, and teaching doesn't mean abusing your power. If you think my daughter and every other student who has come forward is lying, then perhaps it's you who can't handle the truth." The man sat down, visibly flustered, as a few people in the crowd applauded. Amelia returned her attention to the board. "This isn't just about one person's opinion versus another's. This is about facts, and the facts are clear. MS. Sanders is unfit to teach. If you reinstate her, you are telling every student in this school that their voices don't matter, that their safety doesn't matter. Is that the message you want to send?" The board president cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain control of the meeting. "Mrs. Harper, we understand your concerns, and we assure you that we take them seriously. However, we must also follow due process. With all due respect, Amelia interrupted, her voice sharp. Due process shouldn't be an excuse for inaction. You've had weeks to investigate, and the evidence is overwhelming. The time for excuses is over. The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the auditorium. Even some of the board members looked shaken by Amelia's words. The board president held up his hands, trying to restore order, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The crowd was on Amelia's side, and the pressure was impossible to ignore. After several more hours of heated discussion, the board finally announced their decision. Ms. Sanders' appeal to return to her position was denied, and she would be permanently removed from the school district. Additionally, the board committed to a series of reforms, including mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, increased oversight of classroom materials, and the creation of a student-led council to address concerns of bias and discrimination. As the meeting adjourned, Amelia felt a wave of relief and triumph. It wasn't a perfect resolution, no single decision could undo the harm that had been done, but it was a step forward. Tamika, standing beside her mother, felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, she saw the possibility of change not just for herself, but for every student who came after her. As they left the auditorium, Amelia turned to Tamika and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did this," she said softly. "Your courage, your strength, they made this happen." Tamika smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "We did this," she replied. Together, and as they walked out into the night, the weight of the fight began to lift, replaced by the knowledge that they had made a difference. In the weeks following the school board's decision to remove Ms. Sanders permanently from her position, the atmosphere at Tamika's school began to shift. It wasn't a seismic change, not yet, but the weight of Amelia Harper's fight had clearly left its mark. The community had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the environment their children were being raised in, and the conversation had finally begun to evolve. Parents who had once remained silent out of fear or apathy now spoke openly about their own children's experiences. Teachers, many of whom had quietly harbored frustrations with the school's culture, began to advocate for reforms that would foster equity and respect for all students. For Tamika, the change was bittersweet. Though Ms. Sanders was gone, the scars left by the ordeal hadn't fully healed. Some of her classmates still treated her with coldness, blaming her for the disruption to their comfortable routines. Others, however, had shifted from passive bystanders to quiet allies. One day, a classmate she barely spoke to before the incident approached her in the hallway. "Hey," Tamika, the girl said, hesitating slightly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not standing up for you sooner. I saw what Ms. Sanders did, and I should have said something, but I was scared." Tamika looked at her, surprised by the admission. "Thanks," she said quietly. "It means a lot." Moments like that gave her hope, even if the path forward still felt uncertain. Her mother, as always, was her greatest source of strength. Amelia had made sure Tamika understood that she wasn't just a victim in this story, she was a catalyst for change. Amelia, meanwhile, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the promises made by the school board didn't become empty words. She attended every follow-up meeting, scrutinized every proposed policy, and pushed for actionable timelines. Her persistence paid off. Within a month, the school district rolled out a comprehensive plan that included mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, a thorough review of classroom materials, and the establishment of a student council tasked with addressing concerns about bias and discrimination. The council was one of the most significant changes, and Amelia was especially proud when Tamika was asked to join as a founding member. Initially hesitant, Tamika eventually agreed, realizing that her voice could make a difference for other students who might feel as isolated and powerless as she once had. At the council's first meeting, Tamika sat in a circle with a diverse group of students, each bringing their own experiences and perspectives. Some spoke about feeling invisible in classrooms where their cultures were never acknowledged, while others shared stories of blatant prejudice they had faced. It was difficult to hear at times, but it was also empowering. For the first time, Tamika felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that could create real, lasting change. Back at home, Amelia reflected on how far they had come. She thought about the moment she first saw Tamika in tears, her hair ruined and her confidence shattered. The fight had been exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but it had also been transformative. Amelia knew this wasn't the last battle she would face. Systemic issues like the ones at Tamika's school didn't disappear overnight. But she also knew they had planted seeds of change, and that was enough to keep her going. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Tamika turned to her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think things will really be different now?" she asked. "I mean, not just for me, but for everyone." Amelia considered the question carefully before responding. "Change doesn't happen all at once," she said. "It's like planting a tree. You don't see it grow overnight, but every day it gets a little stronger, a little taller. And eventually it becomes something unshakable." Tamika nodded, her face serious. "I want to help it grow," she said quietly. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did." Amelia smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "And you will," she said. "You already are." Over the next few months, Tamika found new ways to channel her energy into positive action. She started working on a school-wide art project, a mural that would be painted on one of the exterior walls of the building. The theme was unity in diversity, and Tamika invited students from every grade to contribute. Each student would add a piece of their own story to the mural, creating a vibrant tapestry that celebrated the unique identities within their school. The project quickly gained momentum, with students, teachers, and even parents coming together to help. On weekends, the school courtyard buzzed with activity as people painted, shared stories, and bonded over a shared vision. For Tamika, the mural became more than just an art project. It was a symbol of resilience, a way to reclaim the space that had once felt hostile and turn it into something welcoming and inclusive. When the mural was finally completed, the school held a small unveiling ceremony. Tamika stood at the center of the crowd, her heart pounding as she prepared to give a speech. Public speaking wasn't her favorite thing, but this moment felt too important to shy away from. Before this mural. She began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Our school didn't always feel like a place where everyone belonged. But I think we've proven that when we come together, we can create something beautiful. This mural isn't just about art, it's about who we are and who we want to be. And I hope it reminds everyone who sees it that we're stronger when we stand together." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in months, Tamika felt truly at peace. She glanced at her mother, who stood at the edge of the crowd, beaming with pride. Amelia gave her a small nod, as if to say, "You did it." The mural became a permanent fixture at the school, a daily reminder of the power of unity and the importance of standing up for what's right. And though Tamika knew there would always be challenges ahead, she also knew she had the strength to face them. With her mother by her side and a growing community of allies, she was ready to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved to feel seen, heard, and valued. In the end, the fight wasn't just about holding one teacher accountable. It was about changing a culture, creating a legacy, and ensuring that every student, no matter their background, had a place to thrive. And that, Tamika realized, was a victory worth fighting for.